This is a technical talk and I will be making some forward-looking statements. So here's the notice and disclaimer. All of this is available on the Southern Cross Gold website if you wanted to look at any of the other information in detail. First off, I'd really like to make some acknowledgements. There's a huge list of people on the bottom of this screen of some very important board and geo members. It does take a team to make these kind of discoveries. We also have to thank the traditional owners of the land, the Taungurung, for their continued and ongoing support on this project, as well as our local Mitchell Shire Council. And I know that there's probably a few names that I've missed out on this list, but we'll keep adding to it as we go. So who we are and what we're going to be going through today. So currently to date, as of the last press release, we're up to 38 100 gram meter intercepts on the Sunday Creek project. We've reported about 119 drill holes and we've got 47 vein sets that we've managed to confidently wireframe together, with many more in the works that you'll see coming out with more drilling. We've got 3 pretty clearly stated objectives of demonstrating the high grade nature of this area, as well as demonstrating the volume that it can grow to become, and demonstrating the scale, not just regionally, but also with depth and along strike. We currently have 4 diamond drill rigs operating on site with the aim to go up to 5 in the next couple of months and then 6 in the third quarter of the year. We're fully funded with a recent rights issue of $10 million, so we're up to $13.5 million. We're fully funded and permitted, and we've got about 133 hectares of freehold land around the project. So team structure. So we're a pretty tight-knit team. We all live locally in the area or whilst we're working there. There is a broad range of experience. So we've got folk that have worked in Fosterville, Costerfield, Ballarat and Stawell. So these are all existing Victorian mines. So we're really drawing from that underground experience, as well as how we see these things in 3D and understanding locally what could be going on. A little bit of the background on exploration and the mining history of the area. So originally in the 1850s, alluvial mining started out by following the creek beds and then starting the sluicing their way up through the hills. And then the surface mining in the 1860s down to about 30 meters. And then through the 1880s and 1890s, they started sinking some shafts with the deepest down to about 180 meters at the Golden Dyke. In the early 1900s, there was some cyanide works done on some of the tails. And then World War I hit. Sunday Creek and the local Costerfield mine were some of the few mines to actually remain open during World War I due to the Imperial Munitions Act. So antimony is used in munitions, and it was shipped to Costerfield and processed there. After World War I, the operation did close, and there was a period of not much going on. And then in the 1960, Eastern Prospectors came along and drilled a couple of holes. With mostly focusing around the shallow areas of Christina, a historic mine. And then in the 1980s, CRA or BHP did some costaining and got some pretty large and broad shallow oxide results, whilst in the 1980s through to the 1990s, Osmin drilled about 29 drill holes. And this is probably the key that I want to start pointing out. So this was the first 100 gram meter hit of the project, and it was in the shallow upper areas. And then in 2008, BDL Resources drilled about 30 RC holes with 7 diamond tails. Once again, still that oxide focus, as we didn't have the discovery story of the high-grade Fosterville mine nearby. So the focus was very much in the shallow areas. In 2020, Mawson acquired the ground after a period of quiescence of exploration and hit the ground running with a couple of diamond drills. You'll see here that in 2021, we started increasing our results through this area. We got our first 100 grams per ton individual assay. And then in 2022, the acceleration of the program, you can see those 100 gram meter hits start increasing. And then through to 2022, we actually had our first, 2023 was our first 1,000 gram individual assay result. And then in 2024, you can see we're still accelerating our drilling. We've released about 5,500 meters to date, and we've got about another 5,500 meters that's getting logged or in at the lab waiting on assays at the moment. Our intent is to accelerate our drilling through the acquisition of a couple of additional drill rigs, and we'll be at 6 rigs spinning for about 45,000 meters of drilling this year. And the key takeaway of this point as well isn't just the fact that, yes, we're drilling more meters, so we're getting more 100 gram meter hits. If you actually looked at the ratio of 100 gram meter hits to meters drilled, steadily year on year, we're actually decreasing the average number of meters we need to get a 100 gram meter hit. So early on in the project, it was around 2,000 meters. It went down to about 1,800, 1,500, and this year to date, we're sitting around the 1,000 meters for a 100 gram meter hit. And this is a component of we're now starting to understand that geology and really hone in on these high grade results. So if you just took a cut of the database, this would also be reflected in the fact that this isn't taking, and a note I should make is that this isn't taking into account any true widths or anything. This is just straight raw assays coming out of the database, cut at 2 meters at 1 gram gold equivalent. And you can see that over time, our grades have increased while the widths have remained about steadily the same. Now, we always like to say good projects always get better, and this is definitely the case here. But it also shows that ability for us to hone in on the higher grade material, which is partially a component of we're drilling deeper in the project and honing in on the brittle to ductile, which I'll touch on in a bit, but also just understanding the interactions between the altered sediment and the dike. So the key ones to take note of here is obviously the AuEq gram meters here and some of the widths that we've got in the project, so nice and consistent. Now I keep talking about the brittle to ductile transition, so we're going to zoom out a little bit and we're going to go through some Victorian geology. And some key differences in this is a temporal relationship first with, we all have quite often heard the stories of the Bendigos and Ballarats, which produced about 82 million ounces of gold back in the early gold rush. But the issue is that they're difficult to reconcile in modern means. This is typically because they form at a more mesozonal depth. They formed as saddles, and they don't have necessarily a lot of distinctive geochemistry that ties them together. Whilst if you jump up 70 million years later and a lot more shallow emplacement, we get what we call these epizonal style mineralization events, or this is also known as shallow orogenic events. And these, the amazing thing about these deposits in Victoria is that they have a high amount of antimony in the form of stibnite in them. And the beautiful thing about stibnite is that it's a very temperature pressure controlled element. And so when you crack open a vein, you reduce your pressure and your temperature, and you drop the stibnite out, and it drags the gold with it. And what this means is we get a more consistent result between two intercepts that have a higher or more anomalous antinomy result, because they're going to be able to retain that gold within. We also see this beautiful vertical zonation that as we go deeper within these systems, you get a more focused system, but it also allows you to tell where you are in a system when you're drilling. So you might get a broader, more brittle hit higher up in the surface, and as you start drilling down, you're getting more ductile features. That's telling you your transition and where you're sitting in the system. Typically, these systems range anywhere from 2 to 2.5 kilometers vertically, and you can see that transition quite often in the Victorian sphere seems to occur around the 700 to 800 meters, as we haven't lost much of the system to erosion or processes like that. What I mean when I talk to a brittle to ductile environment is more of these, we get a lot of extension veins coming through, so they've got these coxcomb textures running through. The grey silver colour here is the stibnite, and we've also got some disseminated arsenopyrite and pyrite. And then when we go to a more ductile environment, we get these broader, larger width shear veins, and you can see that there's a whole lot of multi-phase generational events. You can see the banding here of the stibnite. We've got some complex breccias in here with stibnite. We've even got what we call pressure dissolution stylolites, which are the quartz vein actually getting dissolved, and you upgrade your gold tenor by doing so. And this can be observed as we go into the deeper areas. So we start to see more and more prevalence of these ductile features, or shear veins as we call them. And if you actually took a look at Sunday Creek, we can use a proxy of arsenic over antimony. So antimony forms typically sub 250 degrees, and arsenic can form in arsenopyrite and other minerals up to 350 plus. So we can use it as a temperature proxy if we look at the ratio of them. And we see around the 600 to 700 meters, we're starting to see this change from more cooler colors here on the scale, which is a higher antimony to arsenic ratio, to higher arsenic to antimony ratio as we go down with depth. Now, a key one I want to make note of as well, whilst I've drawn it as a flat dashed line in here, it is more of a transitional zone. And what you'll see is on individual veins, you'll have, that's a poor color, individual zones, you'll have one might occur at one height and the other at another, and then at a different height. And that's all because each vein is occurring at a certain time point, which was at a certain temperature for that vein. And so they're all going to have slightly different elevations. So it's more of a ductile window that we might be able to call it, that we're seeing that transition in. And we're just starting to touch into that now. We'll also start to see an enrichment of sulfur salts, and we have started seeing more fibrous sulfur salts with depth, and they're an indication of we're becoming a sulfur saturated and getting to our peak temperatures in this area, and they're usually associated with the high grade visible gold. All right, so now we'll take a look at the geology of the area. So we're just going to zoom out ever so slightly and look into our main drill area. So what we're looking at on the screen here is our main areas of drilling, which is the Apollo and Rising Sun areas. So you can see if I rotate the view carefully. Through here, you can see where our main drilling focus is, but the main point that I wanted to make of looking on is the geometry of the area. So typically what we describe it as is a ladder lying on the ground, and the way we explain that is we've got this altered sed and pyritic halo that runs in an east to west orientation, and then we have the which would be called the rails of the ladder, and then the rungs would be the veins coming on a northwesterly orientation, and they would be equivalent to our rungs of the ladder. This geometry of this northwesterly orientation that I've just drawn on the screen there, you can see is quite typical of the Melbourne zone. We see this orientation. The atypical nature of it is actually this east-west trending dike that's actually cross-cutting across our fold hinges, which are also trending on this northwesterly orientation. We see if we take a section through from A to A prime on the next slide. So if we now take a look at that A to A prime slice on the northwesterly trend, we can have a look. So we're just looking through here, sliced along. We can see that the nature of that is a slightly steep to the north dipping dike with a surrounding altered sediment halo. And then surrounding that is a much broader pyritic halo. And then we go into our unaltered sediments sitting through here. What that looks like in core is you have your unaltered sediments, which are more of a mudstone, siltstone, classic low energy turbidite sequence with occasional sandstones through it. And then as we approach the main dike body, you can see that this pale tan color comes through, and that's the alteration, which is a carbonate sericite cementation. And here we've got an example on the right with some disseminated pyrite and some quartz carbonate veins. Now, as you then go through the dike, you'll then transition back into the altered sediment, and you can see that it fades out back into the unaltered sediments. So it's a really visual ore body for us while we're drilling. We can see when we're coming into the main areas of interest. But interestingly, when you actually look at the hyperspectral data into these surrounding sediments, you can actually see that there's a much broader signal that we observe. So you see a change in Ferroan carbonates increasing. We also see a change from fengitic to muscovitic as we approach the mineralization. And this is also reflected in the geochemistry of the system. So here I've just colored all the points of individual assays in the area of arsenic results, and we've colored it by lithology. So what we see here is about this area here is where you see the red dots fall off, and that's where we've observed any pyrite or sulfide in the wall rock. And so you can see we go from quite high arsenic and it decreases down. But the really cool thing is when you actually step out, you can see that there's another signature sitting in about to here that we don't see a lot of visible sulfides, but we're still getting anomalous arsenic. So up to 170 meters away from our main dike structure, we can actually still get a geochemical response for this system. And the way I always like to say it is big deposits have big footprints, and this has a large footprint for us until we get to our background siltstone mudstone level of around 20 ppm arsenic. A question we often get is how are you going to model or predict this style of mineralization? And there's probably 4 key components that come about from this. First off, we've got 50 years of historic mining records, which is a beautiful thing to have, and it really helps inform us on what was mined at the time, and specifically the high-grade veins that were mined at the time. So you can see here in the historic records, we've got a couple of intercepts all through here, and they line up with some of our mining, our drill results, same through here. We also look at geological likeness, so how the structures look like to each other, and we'll touch on these points in a little bit. We also use structurally orientated drill core with a confidence measurement on how certain we are that the bottom of hole has been recorded correctly. And we also look at geostatistics of our modelled shapes to see how they are being represented in a statistical manner. What do I mean by geological likeness? So I've got a little section on here that's just looking on a north-northwesterly, so we're just cutting across some of those vein sets. And what we have typically observed is that we go from our barren sediments, we start seeing pyrite coming in, and then as we start getting to the cores of these vein sets, we start seeing an increase in vein intensity. So we see a lot more of these extension veins on a consistent orientation that I'm highlighting on this right image through here. And then we hit what we call our high-grade core, which will be a larger shear vein typically that has a much higher tenor. Now these range anywhere from 0.1 meters to 1.5 meters true width. They're typically plus 20 grams all the way up into the plus thousands of grams gold, and they're typically of a high or anomalous antimony, like upwards of 5%, whilst the vein sets that we then can see even further in this area are typically anywhere from 0.5 meter to 10 meters wide and grade around the 1.8 to all the way up to 12 to 20 grams, and then anywhere down from the 0.1% antimony to 5.2%. And so we see this consistent orientation throughout all of our veins, and sometimes we even see that we actually get 2 of these high-grade cores rather than 1. Sometimes you'll just have just the vein set, and then as you proceed either deeper or higher up, you'll get a shear vein forming in a certain area. We use a lot of structural geology in the area. Specifically, we take all vein measurements that we can capture in our system. And here I've just taken a little snip out of looking at some of our highest confidence intervals, and we can look at all the stibnite bearing veins, and we can see they've all got in general a north to northwesterly trend. We can also see if we looked at all the visible gold logged here, we can see that it's also on a consistent orientation. And an interesting one to note is that the pyritic veinlets, which typically are what we associate with the earliest stages of mineralization, actually trend on a more slightly dipping to the north, but on an east-west trend, and that mimics the orientation of the dike. So we can say with quite strong confidence that we've got our vein sets are on a north-northwesterly orientation, which we can model and separate out, and then we can look to model out a lower sulfide halo that runs along with the dike. And then finally, we talk about the geostats, or the coefficient of variation, which looks at the erraticness of our or continuity of our modelled shapes. And it's probably one of the most important things when it comes to eventually completing a mineral resource, as well as making sure that what we're modelling is making sense. So typically what we say is a low CV of, say, under 2.5 to 3 is in a good position. Ideally, we want it to be below 2. And the more data we add, usually the more we improve it. And by pulling out those high-grade cores from the vein sets, every time we pull one of those out, we make sure that we don't smear that high grade across into the vein set area, and that volume isn't overestimated and the grade isn't overestimated. And it also improves the CV for estimation. And so here I've just taken a couple of example snips out of our Rising Sun and Apollo areas. And Apollo we have a lot more data for currently as it's shallower up in the system and we've drilled it a lot more, but you can see that we've got a relatively good consistent CV, although there are some standout areas that we need to follow up on. But the key note is that on the right here we've got grade, and a lot of these high CV ones are with a higher grade sitting in them, and what that means is we haven't yet subdomained out the high grade material. Whilst as an example in Rising Sun, I've got all my high grade results, which are the high grade cores, all subdomained out on the right, and you can see the average grade goes all the way up to 800 grams a ton for just the assays cut within that shape. And you can see they've got really good CVs. And for the corresponding intervals, if you zoomed in on those areas, you'd see that they match in with some of these results in here. So by pulling out those high grade cores, we can really improve our continuity story. We also look at it from the lab-based and sample-based level of reproducibility. So here I've just taken an original sample, so the original sample submitted to the lab for fire assay, and then that we've gotten the lab to take a second scoop and repeat the fire assay. And here we're looking to make sure that when the sample's gone to the lab and been pulverized and split, that they've managed to homogenize it consistently. If we had a highly nuggety system, what we would expect to see is that one sample might get the nugget or multiple nuggets and another sample will have none, and so we would have poor reproducibility. But because the gold through the system is relatively consistent and of fine nature, we see that we have a nice consistent trend. And if you took a comparative look at Fosterville, which is about 100 k's to the northwest, you could see that that is also on a consistent trend. I've just snipped our results to the 20 grams to make it comparable to these images. Whilst if we then went to Bendigo, which is in the Benambran, the Bendigo zone, totally different geological timing and fluid event, you can see that it's quite nuggety. And so the reproducibility is quite different. And so what we'd be expecting would be a CV of, say, greater than 5 for one of these deposits, whilst Sunday Creek and Fosterville would be looking at probably a CV of less than 2.5. My handwriting's terrible at the moment. We can also look at this in another method to show that have a look at that nuggety effect and the reproducibility. And so what we can do is, instead of just doing 2 fire assay scoops, we can compare a fire assay to what we call a screen fire assay, where we take our original 25 gram fire assay scoop, get an analysis, and then we actually fire to extinction the rest of the sample. So we use up the entire sample that we've submitted to the lab, but it gives us essentially the entire gold within that sample. And take note that this graph is now going all the way up to nearly, I think the upper result there is a 7,330 grams a ton individual assay, which was from SDDS 107. And the takeaway that we see is when we split the core in half and we send one half to the lab, we should be able to consistently see visible gold on either side or spread throughout the sample. And so we're always sampling the exact same side of the core. So in our case, we're taking the upper half from the reference line, and we're not biasing ourselves by only taking the good looking bit of core. We have consistent procedures in place to make sure we don't do that. So I'm now going to take a step back in the system and we'll talk to a few more of these locations that I've mentioned. So I mentioned earlier Bendigo and Ballarat's of being a different timing. So if we look on this map, we've got Sunday Creek sitting over here about an hour's drive just north of Melbourne, and we're sitting in these orange areas which are known as the Tabarabaran, and then we've got the green which are known as the Benambran, or the 440 million years ago event. Now these are our mesozonal deep events, and they typically formed under east to west compression, and they form a lot more linear trends and typically shallow plunging systems. Then if we jump ahead 70 million years to the Tabarabaran, or the Melbourne zone, we had a more northeast to southwest structural regime going on and compressive event, and we've actually managed to emplace a little bit of that onto the Bendigo zone, but then we've also formed all of the rest of the Melbourne zone. And we typically see a bit more of a northwesterly trending orientation. So for note as well, we've got the Fosterville mine, which is about 9 million ounces of past production and resource, as well as Costerfield, which is about 2 million ounces of past production and current resource. So Fosterville is about 110 k's away and is considered of Tabrabaran, and the Costerfield operation is about 60 k's away. And a note as well, Costerfield does have that steep orientation, as well as Fosterville having a steeper orientation than the Bendigo zone. Just looking on this image, I've just highlighted all the purple dots on the screen are all the epizonal or shallow orogenic events typified by the presence of stibnite, and all the yellow dots are just gold occurrences only without the presence of the stibnite. So you can see quite clearly there's a bit of a split coming through here, which is highlighting the difference between the Melbourne zone and the Bendigo zone. We've also got the Fosterville mine, Costerfield mine with the Southern Cross Gold Redcastle extensions to the north, which I won't touch on today, and then we're going to focus back in on the Sunday Creek area. And so whilst predominantly I'm going to be talking about the main drill area that is in here with our Rising Sun and Apollo vein systems that we've been talking about, we have been completing some regional mapping over the last year or so, as well as some regional drilling that we released late last year. So we do have some quite anomalous and significant gold results out there while we were trying to understand the structural setting and geology. And we've also managed to date to confirm we've got about 10 kilometres of the main dike trend running along here, but we also do have another historic occurrence of dike up here, which is the aftermath, and we've also managed to identify some dike outcropping in the creek down here, which is another parallel trend. So we've got about 3 parallel trends of this dike host to date. Also to note in here is we've got the grey dashed lines are our fold axes, which you can see are trending in the northwesterly orientation. And we've got these late brittle gouge faults that are chopping up and just offsetting everything around a little, which when we zoom into the main area again, we'll point out another one of those. The beautiful thing of epizonal deposits is quite often they can help us in their geochemistry because we've got that antimony flavor to it. The antimony, arsenic, gold, and using some manganese, we can actually highlight these geochemical anomalies really focused in. So here we've just got a little bit of an index that we've worked together of just an amalgamation of all 4 elements, and it clearly highlights our known mineralization in all the historic occurrences, as well as highlighting some other areas of interest to follow up on, which we'll touch on in a sec as well. So as a component of this pyritic halo that I mentioned earlier in the alteration system being up to 170 meters around this system, or hundreds of meters sometimes, what we can actually use is we've found offset IP is a really useful method of looking at the chargeability shell to define where this sulfide halo is. We've done that in the main drill area through here, which was completed in COVID, and we're now expanding out, planning a footprint to go out into the regional area to then help focus our efforts on the areas of interest and reduce our target areas. So you'll keep an eye on that, and we'll aim to do that later on in this year. Another key component that was acquired quite early on by Mawson originally was the LiDAR through the area. And so here we can actually see historically where the old timers will have been sluicing up the creek, and then they've followed and sluiced all the way up the hill, and then they found the outcropping dike, which has kept our consistent orientation. And then they've mined the vein sets or high-grade veins on this northwesterly orientation. And we're sitting about 6 to 7 kilometers away from the main drill area, and these orientations are remaining consistent. You can see as well, we repeat this as we've gone across a fault, and then we've had that orientation still continuing, and then we've had our north-northwesterly orientation. Now these faults are a mixture of between dextral as well as apparent sinistral. So they're just chopping up. These are probably some of the larger offsets we see in the area, but as we zoom back into our main drill area, we can actually see that consistent orientation as well as the fault offset that we'll see in a sec. So here we've got our rails, and then we've got our rungs running along in the north-northwesterly orientation. And we sometimes see these even trend up to 120 meters, such as the Gladys area in the Apollo. So now that we've done the zoom out, we're going to start focusing in a little bit more on the project. So I've already highlighted some of these veins, but the key ones now I wanted to touch on was some of the orientations. So typically in here, I've talked to the strike length being up to 110 meters. We average between the minimum of 20 meters, let's say, up to about 40 to 50 meters on average, with that maximum 110 observed. We see the veins can extend up to 500 to 600 meters, but we currently haven't defined the bottom of a single vein set yet. So here we're down about 560 meters. They tend to repeat on the average of 10 to 20 meters through these areas. We seem to see an increase of these vein sets where we have fold hinges crossing through and thickening up our dike package, as well as extending that strike through that area. And as we step down, you'll take note that we have a golden orb fault that I'll show in a second through here that's actually hidden the rising sun system from surface. So one vein set was mined historically at surface, and all the other ones were hidden to surface expressions. So geochemistry might not necessarily highlight it here, but this is where the IP will come in useful to highlight these blind deposits. We've also got, just highlighted here, this was the deepest working to date at Golden Dyke, being 180 meters deep, and we've also got Apollo down to 100 meters. So here in yellow, we've just got the currently drilling or waiting in the lab holes. We also have, as of the other day, an additional hole going in underneath hole 82, which was currently our deepest hole stepping through the rising sun system. So that one will be in there soon. And here's the golden orb fault, which truncates and offsets our rising sun system and hid it from surface. The main other thing I wanted to point out here is the green dots on the screen right now. We've got 20 to 50 gram meter AuEq hits, and then we go, the yellow are 50 to 100, the orange are 100 to 500 AuEq gram meters, and then the reds are the 500 gram meters. And that's really where we can start to see growing and really adding significant increases in grade and ounces to the project by focusing in, as we've done a little bit of two relatively close spaced drill holes through here, highlighted that consistent high grade tenor. And so now we're planning a little bit of Navi work in that area to drill out those areas to a higher confidence to understand that continuity. We'll now take an individual view down one drill hole. So we've looked at it as a generalized geology, and now we'll look what it looks like on the drill hole scale. For note, the yellow dots here are all the visible gold on the screen. And this was our currently best hole to date, which is STD 107. So we're going to start at the surface at 0, and we'll make our way down to about 1,000 meters-ish vertically by the end of the slice. And the other thing to take note is that each of these ticks is about 10 meters. So we're going to continue down, and we'll see the examples of the rails of the ladder with the rungs coming across. And you'll see that we'll go through our pyritic halo into our altered sediment, into our dike, and back out again. And you'll take note of some of these fault offsets that we're going to slice through. As we just zoom down along, you'll see these vein sets are continuing on a relatively consistent frequency. The differences that we've got highlighted here are the ones with the crosses are our extension veins coming out at about a 30-ish degree angle to our shear veins, which are the more thickly defined units. Typically, what we're seeing here as well is a zonation of it that we see these extension veins increasing in frequency, and then we hit our high grade cores, and then as we come out, we see the vein density decreasing. And conceivably, people often ask about the mineability of these, and whilst we're still in the very early stages and looking at some of these options, you could conceivably look to either take these with a jumbo, single boom jumbo, and mine them as individual veins, or you could look at more bulk mining options. So we're still evaluating which way we could go. Now, as we continue down into the system, the one thing I also wanted to point out was that here we're in the center of the dike, and as we step further down into the hole, we'll go into altered sediment on the hanging wall, and then as we go even further down into the dike, into the drill hole, we'll go down into the footwall of the system. So we're not just drilling, say, the dike of the system and seeing that high-grade nature. We're seeing it consistently across from the dike into the altered sediment. And this result that we're now just going to zoom down to is actually one of our high-grade vein sets. So here we've got Rising Sun 80, which has the best hit to date on the project, which was 1 meter at 2,318.8 grams a ton AuEq. And we're just going to now have a slice look along the long section view of this vein. And so here you can see that we've got relatively consistent high grades. So we've got 3.3 at 271, 1 meter at 2,300, and then 5 at 8. So what we're looking at following up on in the near term is this navvying around this area to get some really high, closer spaced intervals through here to confirm the continuity of that high grade nature of it as we continue to expand the footprint in other areas. And then the final zoom in as well is to show that, how I mentioned earlier, sometimes you'll have a high grade core with extension veins, and other times you'll have just the high grade, just the extensional vein sets in these areas. And what we want to keep an eye on is as we drill deeper down or in other areas, we might see that this changes and becomes a high grade shear vein or even gets multiple ones of those. So that's where we can really bring the value around, focusing in on these high grade areas. Just zooming back out, so we've managed to travel from the top surface all the way down to the depth through there. And what that looks like is our exploration target that we released at the start of the year. So we've got the Apollo area highlighted in red, and we've got the Rising Sun area highlighted in red as well. We took it down to a kilometre depth because that was the deepest mineralization to date at the time. And through some rigorous top cuts of the lower range being 24 grams a ton and the upper grade range being 67 grams a ton, we ended up with 1 to 1.6 million ounces at a grade range of 7.2 to 9.7 grams a ton AuEq. Now this was predominantly before we'd started pulling any high-grade cores out of Rising Sun because we didn't have the drill density at the time. And you'll also see that this probably represents about 3% of our drill tested area along strike of the dike, which is about the 10 Ks long. And so for the focus for the next 6 to 12 months is going to be expanding out to the west through the Golden Dyke and Apollo historic areas, as well as testing down into depth below Apollo and stepping east of Apollo. So you'll probably end up seeing about 2 rigs sitting over in the west area, expanding that, 2 around the Rising Sun, expanding into this area, as well as 2 in Apollo and out to the east. And you'll potentially see some deeper holes going in, showing that depth potential of these systems, since we do know that typically from observed mines in Victoria as well as around the world for epizonal styles that they can exist for 2 to 2.5 kilometres. The met work that was done earlier on in the year was utilising just the mine up the road Costerfield's flow sheet. So it was just a simple grind, gravity, and then float to get the antimony out. It produced about 80% non-refractory free gold. And now we're going to look at optimizing the gold into a gravity and then minimizing the arsenic into an antimony arsenic con, either through some blending or sequential flotation. So we've got some further met work in the background going on. And I keep mentioning antimony, and I probably should have mentioned a little bit earlier what it's actually important for. So it represents about 20% of the in situ value of the project, so it is a significant component. It's used in nearly every single bit of plastic, a hell of a lot of solar panels these days of clarifying the glass, and it is important for munitions. So we've kind of gone full circle with the original mining of the area being prolonged due to World War One to now being in demand for munitions once again. Our plan, as I said earlier, was to accelerate from 4 drill rigs to 6 by the end of the year. Here I've just got a loose schedule in showing that that expansion is occurring. But the key thing that we're aiming to do over the next 12 months with those 6 rigs is really demonstrate that high grade nature by doing those Navi infill around those high grade cores, demonstrating that volume by expanding out to the east and west, and demonstrate that scale by stepping down with those deeper holes as well as stepping out regionally and showing the potential of the whole area. And through that all, we hope to be able to, our stated aim has been to build an exploration target of 3 million ounces gold equivalent of around that 10 grams a tonne range. And so we're going to drill about 60 kilometers in the next 12 months. Yeah, that's the talk for now. I've just got a little summary slide here. The key takeaway is we're really only getting started when you look at the footprint that we've drilled and the system is so large scale. We really need to keep expanding and exploring this area. We've got a really seasoned team that have a lot of experience in Victorian gold and understanding what the controls on these systems are. And I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Okay, well, thank you for the presentation, Kenny. That was as comprehensive as always. You guys have obviously been extremely successful in the since last we spoke with you, which was 3-4 months ago. So a lot has happened since then. Cost of capital has more than halved in a very short period of time, since your market cap has more than doubled, which is very good. And you have raised 10 million Australian, and now you're planning to drill 60,000 meters, which would equate to approximately. I mean, when do you expect to hit? First of all, to hit kind of run rate? There will be 5,000 meters per month. That will be, I assume, on average 10 holes per month or something like that. Fifth rig is coming in soon. Sixth rig is coming in this fall. So you will average it in the next coming months, 3,000-4,000 meters. Is that about correct?
Yeah, we're probably averaging around the 4,000-ish meters a month at the moment. So we'll be increasing that steadily by adding the additional rig. Some of the holes are down to a kilometer of depth. So on average, we're probably only doing about 4 holes a month. But you will see with this additional rig, we are planning some shorter holes as well as the navies because they're basically a daughter hole off a parent hole that we actually won't have to drill as many meters to get as many hits. So you'll actually probably start to see a higher number of drill holes getting reported, even though we're drilling about the same number of meters. It's all about being smart with how we're drilling. And if we don't have to drill 1,000-meter hole and can wedge off and get a good distance away from another hole and get that information, that's what we'll do.
Many birds in one stone. That's good.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask one silly question right off the bat for geologists like yourselves, but I'll try and see if I can get some indicative information from you guys, anyways. So you have a 67 gram per ton top cut for the exploration target, and you're indicating 1.1 to 1.7 million ounces in this little window within a very vast trend, as we guys understand it. How do you think it will end up comparing to reality? I mean, how much of the actual mineralization could be in this very high grade part that you've now currently kind of cut out of that target? Do you have a sense or an intuition of that with the data that you have currently? And how much could be on that upper portion that's currently cut out?
Yeah, I'll give some context for starters. So that original top cut that we applied to the exploration target was probably quite a conservative way to approach it because we couldn't pull out the high grade cores. And what we're seeing is the more and more of these high grade cores we pull out, the higher we can either increase that top cut or what we can do is called a range restriction. So we actually don't need to top cut a result until we're a certain distance away. So we can reflect the reality of the assay. And a key component of that does mean that, yes, the grade will go up and it will be a significant proportion of the ounces could come out of some of these high grade shears. When you're looking at those grade ranges that I was giving of, say, the vein sets are typically, say, 20 grams a ton, and then we're looking at 1,000 gram per ton results, it's quite a
Yes.
difference in proportion. So it's probably something of a similar scale as a percentage if you were to look at it. But volumetrically, they're also quite different, because some of them are tens of meters wide, and then you're down to a half meter, say, high grade shear. So there's a balance in there, but I would say, yeah, that the majority of your ounces are going to come out of those high grade shears, and then the bonus is all the vein sets surrounding.
Mm.
Unless Mike has any additional comments around that.
No, I think that's the right answer. He was trying to ask what will be the eventual tons and grade of our system, but I think the natural variation in these systems is, as Kenny said, they'll tend to increase as the top cut increases, or dissipates, and we go to range restriction only, which is what our resource geologists are informing us we can do when we have enough data. And so we're seeing the CVs drop, coefficients of variation drop with time. And then, how big can this get? Well, we say it's about a third of the way through the core area, and the core area is only 10% our larger trend. So we've tested 3% of the larger trend. So, it's not going to be mineralized right across that trend, of course, but everywhere. But it's the same geology, it's the same dike, that same structure, the ladder structure that Kenny talked about. So it can get a lot bigger, and we know at least over that 1 kilometre or more trend, we've got old mines at surface, we've got near surface within the first 100 or 200 metres of high-grade hits. So it's certainly not big swinging exploration risk. In a relative sense, it's relatively lower risk in that core area. But, we've still got to drill to determine the grade, essentially. I think we know the structure will be there, but what's the grade, and how thick will that package be at depth? And, we've got some anticipation internally around that. We've just got to drill it.
Yes. So, within the exploration target window, how you have about 50,000 meters of drilling there. So some is outside of it now. I would assume it's about 50,000 or something like this within the exploration target window that's targeting that part of the trend, right?
It's probably closer to 45,000 within the exploration target as of today. Yeah, because we did about 2,500 out regionally, and then there's a hell of a lot of drilling we've started fanning out outside of that exploration target, really trying to grow that footprint. So yeah, there's about 45Ks, let's say, in that exploration target, and I think we said around the 30 to 40,000 meters would be needed to drill that exploration target out to a resource. That's on top of that, not taking into account if we switch to a lot more navies or wedging, so you could cut the meters around a bit there. But then, so yeah, with the 60,000 meters that we're proposing in the next 12 months, obviously there's going to be a balance of what we're putting into drilling out that resource or that exploration target that we've got defined, and expanding it out beyond that. So yeah.
Right. What in terms of allocating 40,000 meters, close to doubling the amount of meters spent on that window, what will you think? In terms of being able to reconcile reality of the high grade portion of the mineralization to what you're able to actually model in a resource, how close do you think it might be? Because it's still going to be inferred and indicated as you would classify it, I assume, or if you were to publish a resource after that drilling.
Yeah. Mike, do you want to try and answer that one? I've got probably an answer that I could give, but I don't know how
you
close
go.
to. I'll give you the blunt mine geologist answer, which will be you're never going to know until you mine it. But the way we can build the confidence on these things is by doing this navigational drilling, and we're aiming to do a closer space drilling that we currently require. That so what the resource geologists have advised us for our resource consultants have advised us for our drill spacing, we're actually going to do a tighter spacing than that to increase our confidence and make sure that we understand these high-grade systems. And so that's why we really want to tie in a particular high-grade area and use it as basically a case study to say, okay, we understand this area, so we can now apply it to the rest of the area as long as the geology is staying consistent and understand that system. So yeah, it's going to be a mix. We would be aiming for that was an inferred resource that I was talking to for the amount of drilling we would require. There would probably be a component of indicated mixed in there, just on the natural way we drill, but it all comes down to the final resource calc and what you're going to classify it as.
Sorry, I'll just have a go, Jorn. That answer is completely correct, but we're not running to a resource immediately, right? We've always talked and spoken about increasing the size of this rather than running to a resource in isolation, but it's always a bit of both. Kenny showed 6 rigs, and basically half will be in exploration, half will be in and around the exploration target area, expanding it or infilling around the very high-grade areas. And the way to make this bigger is not just through volume expansion, which, the 3% of the trend is the volume story and the district scale nature of the story, but the grade aspect is a key. And I think what we've got at the moment, all a work in progress, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kenny, but I think 44% of our ounces in Rising Sun are in something like 4% of the mass at the moment, as we're starting to really understand the high-grade nature. And that's what can happen in these systems. You can get a good week's production and it can produce a year's worth of gold. And that's the exciting thing about high grade and just the extreme nature of 1 gram gold is the average grade worldwide, and we're dealing with things that are orders of magnitude above that, and how you treat it and how you understand it is really important. But it shouldn't be lost on anyone the high grade nature of this project.
No, I mean that speaks. When you have, within Rising Sun, 4% is 44% of the ounces. That's in terms of volume, that's pretty incredible. And most of that, I mean, one would assume that occurs, and we can see on the high grade intercepts that this occurs all throughout the exploration target window, and you just have to, I guess, infill drill it and figure it out a bit more, and it can be reflected then at some point in a resource, obviously. But I mean, smart investors will pick this up prior to you having to make it obvious for them with a resource, I would hope.
We'll get there, but in time. We're wanting to make this, 3 million ounces at 10 grams is our stated aim, and we're a fair way down that path, sort of halfway, we said, in the exploration target ish, and once we get to that scale, that's globally significant and a very rare asset. So we'd rather try and prove that than blow our brains out just with the area we've drilled today.
How many years are you giving yourself to do that, by the way?
Oh, well, the 60 kilometres will give us a very good view on whether we are there or not, I think, right? Not in a resource sense, but an exploration target 2, version 2, with getting very close into that exploration target 1 area where we're getting much more confident to perhaps get to close to a resource. But we'll just have to see how all that forms, but over the next year, that's the 3 million ounces at 10 gram. Aim to see that, and it's game on if we start seeing continuity of the high grades in these Navi holes, and it's game on if we start seeing very good hits at depth, between Golden Dyke and Christina. It's game on if we go east and start finding another part of the system there. So all these different inputs can really help us get there. We're focusing in on areas that we think are the best places to explore because they are the lowest risk. They've got drill holes and knoll workings around them, but you just never know. Look what happened at Rising Sun, and we built that exploration target in just a little over a year, really. You can see the stats in Kenny's presentation. At Apollo, where we thought we had a pretty good deposit and our project, and then everything's changed since September, since last year, since Rising Sun started to really develop, and it's just got better and better, and that average grade has just continued to increase, and that's what's made this project so interesting.
Yeah, so just for me to kind of think about that out loud. So you currently have 7 to kind of 9 grams, 1.1 to 1.7 within the exploration window, just to the west, in terms of a strike continuity that you painted up in the presentation, Kenny. That would be about the same strike continuity as the existing exploration window. So when you say 3 million ounces, 10 grams, you would have to have some reconciliation upwards within the exploration target window, and you would not necessarily have to see some major success to depth or some success to east. So you have essentially 3 optionalities in that estimation for exploration target 2. Is that fair to say? I mean, east can significantly outpace that 3 million ounce 10 gram. Depth can also do so if you see success there, and reconciliation could potentially also vastly improve that figure. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, so there's multiple factors that can really target us into those, and so that's why we don't necessarily need all of those factors. We don't need a perfect storm of everything to succeed to get to that stated aim necessarily. We just need enough of them to succeed, and so that's why we can really see like the value in doing each of these step outs and expanding, and the nature of trying to understand and improve that high grade nature of the veins and the continuity there can also have a significant impact for us. So each of them in tandem help, but yeah, they're not necessarily reliant on each other entirely. So it does make it a lot less risky for us.
And then the other one, which you haven't mentioned now, but I think Mike called it bush work or bush drilling. I guess if you go over to Leviathan and that part, I mean, a bit of a regional thing where you have indications, obviously, of strong mineralization as well. You're doing IP for that portion of the property currently. When is that expected to be in your hands and analyzed?
I think we're aiming to have it in at the later end of this year, but ready for that 6th rig. So when it turns up, we can start utilizing that rig to be stepping out in that way and using that IP data. We don't want to collect it once we've already started drilling. We want to have it well in hand and understood, because anything we can do to reduce the area that we need to search for is going to be very valuable. And every time we can reduce and remove a dud potentially drilled hole is a key. So yeah, the idea is to have it pretty much in hand when that 6th rig turns up.
Just got to wait for the ground to dry out. It's winter here now. It's dark and it's 5:15 in the afternoon. You can see over my left shoulder here. So it's wet and cold. So we'll start that survey around in September when things dry out and a bit of wind, and it's a bit easier logistically, which means lower cost survey, ideally.
So realistically, drilling would commence maybe very late this year.
We'd have that 6th rig hopefully, and we can start with some stuff closer to the main drill area, and then step out into the regional out bush probably later right near the end of the year. Yeah, that would be the intent.
Mm. And Mike, just to before I talk about or I ask you about depth east and west, these big, and also reconciliation. We've kind of touched on reconciliation already, but in terms of adding more rigs, if you have great success to depth, you hit something spectacular there. Me and Kenneth spoke last time about depth could potentially have higher grades on average. You could expect to see that looking at the other deposits still known in the area. Could you add more rigs? I think you did say that, yes, you could add even more rigs than 6 last time we spoke, Mike. But you have this contractor that you work with. Does he have capacity to give you access to even more rigs, or we have to find another contractor to kind of top up if that came into the cards? And is that something you could see happening potentially?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we the day that we move away from our current contractor solely will be difficult, because we've got a very good working relationship, and he's a very good contractor, and we're drilling. Last year our average drill contract cost plus assays was 200 Australian dollars a metre, so lowest quartile drilling without a doubt. and Chris is an owner of the business too. He wrote a very large check early on. He really liked what he's seen. He's seen pretty much every project in Victoria and owned many of them himself and restarted mine. So, I think we can get another rig or two out of him. It's really people, not rigs. But we can. It's all around that cost of capital that we spoke about since we first met Yorman, and we don't want to start drilling it out. It's 4 times as much drilling but if you infill it, you've got to go 2 by 2 and 4 times the amount cost. We love the CV and the way that this project's coming together, and Kenny showed that on a slide there where a lower CV lowers your cost of capital. So it all goes to the drilling meters and then how you can build this out. No doubt these systems get better at depth. That's now well written in stone. That's what happened at Fosterville and what made it the highest grade gold mine on earth. That we're in the shadow of the head frame of Fosterville, and made $10 billion a market cap increase for the Canadian market and made it the lowest ASIC mine in the world. Costerfield's seeing that now as it's going to depth. It's seeing higher grades. The antimony's dropping off. Kenny gave a very good description of the temperature that we see and how these systems evolve. And I think what we'll see, and we're seeing it, is that we're starting to see thinner but higher grades as we just go into that shear vein only without the brittle salvages around those shear veins as we go to depth. That's what it seems to be, but the tenor is getting larger, so the grade times width is increasing, and the nature of the system changes as you get into that deeper part of the system. So yes, we'll bring more rigs, and I hope to see more rigs. It would make it a lot easier if we found mineralization out east, because there's nobody out there, and that makes it a lot easier. Whereas west towards Christina, we're getting closer to houses and noise, travelling, literally kilometres through cold mornings down the valley. So putting a lot of rigs to the west is harder than putting a lot of rigs to the east. But there's strategies, and we're implementing them now around sound screens, etc., so we don't get that drift of that little hum on cold mornings, especially.
Right. So you currently have, and I assume these 2 holes are right around the corner, 118 and 122. Both of them are some of the deepest holes you've drilled to date. I think one is close to 1,200 meters to depth. And you released 117, obviously that's released now. That was also a very deep hole. Are you starting, you can't comment on 118 and 122, but if we just look at 117, are you seeing this actually play out? If you speak about that hole, and maybe you can indicate if this higher grade to depth thesis is already with a few holes starting to kind of being confirmed.
Kenny, I'll let you talk to how the system's changing along strike away from the core and changing at depth too, because it's a really interesting story here, Gorm.
Yeah, so I'll start with a long strike because that's probably the key one. So we see the competency contrast between that dike and that altered sed really strengthening it. And then as we go out, we go into more, let's say, weaker sediments. So what we see is in the core of these systems, in that alteration, that visible alteration that I showed in those slides, that bleaching and the dike, we see a lot more fracturing, a lot more frequency of veining. And typically as well, Mike might have not heard me talk about this previously, but because of that brittle nature and you're fracturing so quickly, you're actually dropping the temperature a lot more quickly. So we typically see quite a bigger antinomy halo in that main core zone. And then as you extend out into the weaker rocks, your fracturing isn't necessarily opening up as much. So you're not getting as much fracturing in there. So your veins start to pinch in, but you also have less contrast of temperature, so you're not forming as much stibnite. So that's why we do see a higher grade stibnite core in the system along strike. And then as you go to depth, what you'll see is that change of that Arsenic to antimony is probably the key ratio that you can use geochemically to see it. But also we're starting to observe more sulfur salts in intercepts, and that's a mineralogical change from going from stibnite, which is sub 250 degrees, to sulfur salts, which are plus 250, plus 300 degrees. So we can see the system's getting hotter, which is indicative of a longer lived system, a hotter system, which also then is more focused in its fracturing nature. And so then what you can see is that you're still in that hotter core, but that has the potential as well to start, if you're in a hotter system, that also allows you potentially to increase your strike as well, or your alteration footprint as we go to depth. We haven't necessarily seen that yet, but there's the potential that we might start to see some changes in our strike potential of these systems as we go deeper as well.
I haven't heard him say that bit before.
No, you haven't, because I've been working that one up for a while.
Like that.
Yeah.
But the other point is, and here's something that, forward-looking statements, be aware, but, we're here on a technical call essentially, right, and having a nice technical discussion. We mightn't be and Kenny slightly alluded to it there, we just mightn't be in the best part of the system yet, because it gets better at depth. And we start to see the plus 500 gram hits through the system. Kenny didn't point them out specifically, but they were the big red dots on his long section there when he was showing it come in around 500 or 600 meters, and we're seeing more and more of those, and they're more focused, and it's the way we assay, because we assay and the thinner zones, but they're getting higher grade, and we're seeing a lot of that sulfur salt. So we're starting to see a lot more silver come into the system because of that. Nothing economic, but geologically very interesting. Sometimes hundreds of grams, right? So you can start, and that they come along with that change in mineralogy. So we just may get into that better part of the system. Kenny talked about it there. The strike extents may be changing. But also just into that higher grade part is who knows, right? And that's why Kenny talked about, when he gave you the presentation, that we will put in 1,500 metre holes. We were underground at Fosterville at that depth a week or so ago. So that's where they're mining down in those levels now, about 1,400 metres where we're down, and they're drilling below 2 kilometres. So this system has the potential to be another kilometre from where we've drilled to date. And yes, keep your eye on 118, which is the deepest hole in the system and is the next sequential hole to be reported.
And if I recall correctly, Kenny, I think to the east you didn't have soils and you did not have IP. Is that right?
We had the soils, we didn't have the IP. Yep.
Right. And the soils were not as. It seems like there might be some cover there.
No, there's very shallow cover. We sit maybe a meter of overburden through there, and out to the east we have one of my favorite soil anomalies sitting out there that I highlighted briefly in the run through earlier of the arsenic antimony, gold and manganese. Really highlight a beautiful little bullseye target through there, and hopefully we're going to start stepping out towards that in the near future, as well as we'll have the IP running. The IP does extend over that particular area and highlights a beautiful IP anomaly as well, and coincides with a whole lot of geological features as well. So it's stacking up to look interesting, but we won't know until we stick a drill hole in it. But yeah, the idea is to really overlap a lot of these methods and really have as many geological indicators or geochemical or geophysical indicators to really point us towards the key targets to focus on.
But the east is being held off until you get the IP, which will be in September. So probably October to start drilling. You will not drill towards the east until then. Yeah,
that'd be, say, that's probably 500 meters or 600-700 meters more east of where we're currently drilling in Apollo. So there's still I'm not saying it's like right where we're drilling it at Apollo. It's still a fair way across to the east. The current existing IP survey and extends to.
Yeah. So just to clarify, we have got a kilometre or so of extensions to the east with all the data in hand already that we're just literally starting to test as we speak, and we'll put a few cider holes and follow the dike and the dike structure out through there. But your point about drilling in October, November, December will be 3 to 8 kilometres away post the IP acquisition. That's right.
Right. So it will be kind of a sequential thing. You have these. You have west. You have infill or reconciliation, you have depth, and you have east. Then you have bush as well, but bush will be later. But it seems like west will probably mostly completed by the time east is being going to be commenced, because or is that not
No,
correct?
there's like, because you've got that K&a-half window that we're going to start testing. There's plenty of drilling that'll keep you busy in both the west and the east. So basically they'll be coincident. We actually have more drilling currently in the western area. You would have seen some holes that we'd previously released around Golden Dyke, so we know that it's there and continuing. We're just going to start stepping below some of those and further west. So we've got plenty of drilling to do, that they will be occurring concurrently together.
Okay, so I mean, obviously you can continue stepping out west, but you're giving yourself kind of a 1 km, 800-meter window for this 60 km drill program as it stands currently. Obviously, everything is completely reactive, so making like, oh, we're gonna put 2 there and 2, it's kind of a pointless exercise just for investors. Say, okay, now I know what they're going to do exactly, but it's it doesn't play out like that. But
Yeah, it's
either
all
way, it
dependent
seems
on
like
success.
yeah, and with the depth drilling, usually you guys want you kind of you hit some shallow things along the way, which means that you need parallel structures to the west or the east to hit something along more defined structures to depth. Will you just would you is that the approach? Would you just drill depth in the beneath the exploration target, or will you do that towards the east and potentially west as well? Or you just stick within that window?
Probably focus on where we understand the high grade shoots to be continuing down and target in those areas. So the best chance of showing that the fluid is and mineralization is continuing down is where we'd probably aim to target. Yeah. So I don't really have an answer yet until we've kept drilling and right before we're ready to drill, but we'll loosely target, say, under rising sun, down dip trend of that would be my first hole that I would be preferencing to put in somewhere around there.
Just to pick up on the conversation, just to talk about the strategy and the mix of strategy with technical knowledge. It's a key part of really any exploration program. So we can't just drill with a strategic aim that satisfies the market without understanding what we're trying to do technically. So the technical feeds into the strategy, but equally we can't just go out there and be great geos and doing what we want without having meet the strategy. So it's a lot of what Kenny and I do together is it's sort of overlap really at the technical and strategic point. And Kenny's very good at understanding the bigger picture and the strategy. And I've come from 30 years of doing and loving what Kenny's doing. So it's a key point, and you're trying to unpack that. So the strategy is not to go to a resource too quickly, but equally the strategies that the technical relies on us to understand the system. So drilling it and expanding it within the current footprint and focusing on the grade. The strategy says let's build more ounces, and we can do that through grade. And the technical side says grade and also volume expansion. And then we'll make sensible decisions. And I know it's a bit glib, but we know how to manage exploration programs and bring all those components together. Don't always get it right, but when we get it wrong, we change and modify. Another key point is just on that is that you never want to leave your exploration to the end. So I've really made sure the team's been focused on building what we know today, because that's underpinned everything, and it's worked very well, with better than any of us could have hoped, really, around the world class. Literally, the 3 of the top 10 results over the last year have come from rising sun at depth. But now's the time to start, and that's why we're talking about all the exploration, is to go out there. You won't hear us talking about the exploration targets, when we're talking kilometres away in great detail. We'll be doing the work explaining it. But we really want to just keep one rig dedicated to slowly going there and focusing 5 back on the core area. And then when we find something out bush, we're well placed, right? And if we did it another way, look at it the other way, if we just focused on the core area, drilled that to whatever the market got happy with, and then, oh, what do you got next? And we go out bush and we miss, this would be devalued. So you want to keep it all working there. So exploration strategy and use of your rare or scarce dollars is a science in itself.
Mm. Yeah, it's kind of an art, right? It's because you deal with the market, which is more of a touch and go thing, and then you have the science of geology, and you combine that. It becomes kind of, it's interesting. Yeah, so I guess a more minor point: how is Metwork progressing throughout this year, the next 12 months? Are you doing more? What's the plan there? Because obviously the metallurgy changes the depth as well, and you're getting more core as we go along. So what's the game plan with metallurgy?
So the interesting, I'll touch on one bit first. So the interesting thing on the metallurgy changing with depth, like how I've said, the stibnite will drop out, or we'll have less amounts of stibnite potentially with depth. The great thing of the flow sheet that we're looking at, and I'll use Costerfield as an example because it's the flow sheet we've mimicked, with them seeing a decrease in stibnite, they haven't had a metallurgical difference in their processing side of things, because the key component is while the stibnite drops out and you have less stibnite, you have sulfur salts still, which are stibnite bearing, and they behave very similarly. And we're not seeing, say, a difference in the arsenopyrite doesn't change in its nature. It still looks exactly the same, but we are picking additional samples to make sure that we're covering all of the, say, different arsenic to antimony ratios and different, now that we've started subdomaining and high grade cores versus the vein sets, we're making sure that we recognize those in our samples and use those as representative samples, so we're not biasing ourselves. And now, Mike, you can. Sorry, I butted in.
No, that's great, and as a relative sense, Costerfield's seeing a hell of a lot more go into gravity as a consequence of that change. So what was once 50% is now 70% gravity at Costerfield as they go deeper. Now we, as Kenny said, we're doing a lot more samples, and we've just got to choose the right ones geometallurgically, so we get that variation. And one variation is what you've talked about, is that change at depth where we get less antimony and higher grade gold. The other is just the variation, the natural variation through the deposit, and there's higher arsenic zones and lower arsenic zones, etc. So the key point for us is to, which we didn't do first time around, we got a gravity con around about 20%. Historically, it was 50% from at least the high grade areas. So we know there's room to improve there. And if you want to maximize your payability in these systems, or any system, right? And so the payability for us on gold is, nearly 100% when you get gravity separation. You get maximum payability in gravity. Second is payability in a gold antimony concentrate, and that's anywhere between mid to high 80s right up to 95%. So it's good payability, depending on which smelter or roaster you go to, and then there's the third one, which is a separate pyrite con, and we've got free gold in this deposit, at least 80%. We don't know the last 20% because it's finer, so it could still be free actually, because we haven't done the liberation work to grind it finer to find out. But at least 80% is free gold, so we can leach that pyrite con on site rather than get poor payability in a smelter, which would be in this, I think, in the 60s. And we've got 80% free gold, so we get high 70s just by not sending it to a smelter. Then the other thing to look at is, so that we're talking about smelters, the big weakness of the Western world. This will be one of the biggest antimony projects in the Western world, even though it's 20% in situ byproduct, in situ recovered byproduct potential in versus the gold. But the big weakness in the Western world, if we want a supply chain recreated, is that there's only one smelter at scale, which is in Oman. The rest are in China. So when we go out, and 80+% is controlled by Russia and China in the antimony case, like it is with a lot of critical metals. The weakness is there. So there have been many mines that have used hydrometallurgical processes for antimony. The science does exist. It has been used. and that would allow in-country production of the metal, and it would change the whole outcome with the way that we deal with those three separate products: the gravity, the antimony gold float, and the gold pyrite float. And we could just bump them all together, or get the gravity off and then bump the last two together and deal with them separately. We might need that third one. That's also the optimization, is to try and get all the gold up front and then the rest into the antimony con and not lose too much. And that's understanding grain size and all that kind of thing. So a long answer, but basically we've mimicked a spreadsheet from an adjacent mine. We've demonstrated an economic flow sheet for fit for purpose where the project's at, and now it's optimization of all those details I just spoke about.
So two things, just quickly, I guess. Within the exploration target window, and more to depth, if you test rigorously there after doing the reconciliation, you're going to give even more data for that window. Will that be a good representation along the most of the strike, or do you think it can vary through the strike significantly, where you would have to do even more work if you step out to the west and the east? Obviously, you would have to do some work, but would you have to duplicate the same amount of effort along the strike? And you have one block here, would you have to do the same amount of work there and there as well, you think?
Oh, that's all part of the work to determine whether it is consistent or not. And at the moment, we've got two drill holes, one from Apollo, one from Rising Sun. Kenny can tell me how many we're going to choose for this next stage of work, because that's all under discussion as we speak. But it's cost and variability. And we also know geochemically how these things vary. So I think Kenny's answer will be, we don't expect there to be much variation, but you've still got to do the work to demonstrate that.
Yeah, so typically, like the Rising Sun and Apollo will probably refine and understand our process, and everything we've drilled outside of that area to date hasn't shown any different geochemistry that we can see. So we've seen consistent mineralogy, even regionally, all the way across to Leviathan. That half meter at 17 gram kind of result was consistent in the geology and mineralization style, but you would then still probably take a sample and run it through your optimized spreadsheet or flow sheet. So you're not necessarily going to have to do every single step we're doing now, but you'll just do the end product we come up with for Rising Sun and Apollo is probably what you'd do.
Right, and then so the objective within this year is to understand the continuity on the base of the 60 km drilling, or what's the actual main objective, say, within the next 12 months? There's a
3 million
understanding.
3 million ounces at 10 grams is what we want to try and demonstrate in terms of exploration target Mark II, and near resource or resource from the current exploration target, depending on how it comes together. But we're not going to bang our heads against a wall to try and produce a resource in isolation. We want to make that system bigger. We will de-risk the metal that we've just been talking about. We're going through mining studies as we speak. Kenny just alluded maybe to a little bit about the work that we're doing at the moment. So we'll have a much better idea, and that then feeds all into the mining studies, feed into the mining style and the width of mining and the amount of potential waste rock that you're going to produce to ore, to the met, and what kind of head grade we're going to produce in the met. So it means you don't go and do 50 gram assays, 50 gram pieces of rock and put that through the met process. You put your head grade that you think you're going to mine through. So it will feed into all the environmental work and what's the footprint of the operation look like. So how large or small do we have to make the area where we're collecting a lot of the data? So everything is so interrelated. But in the public domain, the main game on moments will come when we start to see, that towards that 3 million ounces at 10 grams. And, then we see, these ounces in other projects in Australia have been valued. Bellevue, for example, at $300 to $400 an ounce, working up towards scoping study. A lot of work going on behind the scenes on the environmental and social side, but we haven't spoken much about. But that's very real. The antimony piece is very real. I just came back from your part of the world at a conference in Norway that was related to the antimony side of things. So it's many cogs, a lot of the political work that we're doing here in country also to make sure we've got a reference point with the government where we're taking the project. So scoping the framework for the project. So many things as we're running, but the value per share will increase and will lower our cost of capital, which is our major focus, along with keeping all stakeholders coming along with us, is by making it bigger over the next year.
And just to refresh on the strategic side of things, that being crystallized as value for shareholders, it's something that most likely is going to happen at some point. But it's still, last time we talked about this in a bit more rigor, and we kind of landed on, yes, it's probably going to be some economic development. So they might fund infill drilling, potentially. They might fund engineering studies and so on. Is that still the same angle that's most likely to be the one that could crystallize in the coming, say, 3 years, something like that?
Well, we're very serious about taking this towards development. We'll put in more and more skills, where Kenny uses a wonderful term. He calls himself a pretended engineer. And I think it's a great one because we're good geologists. We both, for example, worked in mines, but we know enough to know that we don't have those skills. So there's others that will come in and are here already. We're doing the engineering studies with consultants and different board members, and this is a very, very unique opportunity for a shareholder base. So they do like the idea of taking this through to create one of the highest margin projects on Earth in the gold domain, right? And and you only have to look down the road that Fosterville was, for many of the 4 of the last 7 years, the lowest ASIC mine. So we have the opportunity to follow in their footsteps, in some degree or other, because the system is very similar. The grades are starting to really develop. We're not at the swan zone or have a swan zone yet, but we've got many indications that there could be something of very high grade nature out there. So that's the aim, and we're working towards it. We're not here just drilling it to flip it. That's certainly not the point.
No, and it's in your backyard as well, which is quite nice to be able to come back with a big victory in your home country. That's amazing. Okay, guys, thank you very much. I think that's a pretty good update for people. We'll stay on top of things and follow very closely. If you have one of these big things that might happen, we'll see in the next coming months here, I guess, if one of them plays out.
Always keep your eye on the news flow, Jorm.
Yeah. Pleasure as always. Excellent questions. Love it.